Welcome back to Heaven at Home, everybody. Do you ever feel like you aren't doing enough or that you failed at what God has called you to do? Today we're going to ask God, am I doing enough? There's a lot of times we might find ourselves looking at the progress that we've made in our calling and feeling that we failed or feeling like we haven't done enough. But who told you it wasn't enough? Who told you that you were a failure or that your calling is a failure? I can guarantee that it wasn't God. All that God calls us to do is to be obedient. And Isaiah 1:19 says, "If you are willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land." There's nothing that tells us that we have to be at a certain point in our calling to be good enough. And don't put your calling in the shadow of somebody else's calling. Their calling is no greater than yours, and yours is no greater than theirs. There's a few verses in 1 Corinthians 12 that I want to look at. Verse 14, verses 19 through 20, and verse 27. It says, For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. Now you are the body of Christ, and individually members of it. I heard a friend say once, don't let someone else's strengths become your weakness. What this means is God has given each of us gifts. He's given us each strengths. And just because someone else's strength or gift is different than yours, doesn't mean that has to be your weakness. God has put you in a special place. He has a part in his greater plan that he wants you to be in. And just because you aren't a pastor or a big revival preacher doesn't mean that your calling is any less important. No matter how insignificant your calling feels, or how small or basic of a task that you feel that God has led you to do, have faith and obey as you do that. Luke 17:5-6 says, The apostles said to the Lord, Increase our faith. And the Lord said, If you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you could say to the mulberry tree, Be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it will obey you. Mark 4:31-32 says, It is like a grain of mustard seed, which is sown on the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes larger than all the garden plants and puts out large branches, so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. If God can use faith the size of a mustard seed, don't you think that no matter how small you think your calling is, that it'll be used and that it'll be worth it in the end? One of the biggest pushbacks that I had in starting this channel was I wanted to plan everything out. I wanted everything to be perfect. And I felt that because I didn't have all the equipment or the experience like other channels did, that I wouldn't be successful. And God reminded me that all I needed was to be obedient with what I had. And even once I started my channel, I began to focus on the fame of what this channel could bring rather than what God had called me to do. And he told me something that really changed my perspective. He said that everything that he calls me to say is something that someone needed to hear, something that he wanted somebody to hear. So yeah, it would be awesome to have millions of subscribers like a lot of other channels, but if only one person ever saw a single one of my videos, it would be worth it, because I know that God wanted them to hear it. So just because I didn't have the audience, the experience, or the equipment didn't mean that I wasn't doing enough. Didn't mean that my calling was insignificant. And that's the thing. We only see our callings as small because we've put someone else's calling as greater. We've decided that this person has a greater calling than mine, so mine must be smaller than theirs. But when you stop looking at everyone else, you begin to see what God has called you to do specifically and the part that you play. Your calling is special, and God picked you for it. Everyone's calling has to start somewhere. And just because you are in a different place than they are, doesn't mean that you aren't doing enough. All God calls us to do is be obedient. And if you are doing that, then you're doing enough. That's all for today. Thanks for joining. Don't forget to like and subscribe and keep striving to bring heaven to your home.